Inside the ADX Florence Control Unit, 23 hours alone. In the high desert of southern Colorado sits a prison designed with one primary purpose: absolute control. Inside this facility, inmates considered the most dangerous or disruptive in the federal prison system live under conditions stricter than almost anywhere else in the United States. At the Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence, some prisoners spend 23 hours a day alone inside concrete cells. Contact with other human beings is extremely limited. Movement is tightly controlled. Communication is monitored. And every aspect of daily life follows a system built to prevent violence, escape, or influence over outside criminal networks. The unit at the center of this system is commonly referred to as the Control Unit, the most restrictive environment inside an already maximum security institution. What does life actually look like inside a place built for isolation? How did this prison come into existence? And what happens to the human mind when someone lives year after year in near total solitude? Tonight, we step inside one of the most secure prison environments ever created. But before we continue, if you enjoy deeply researched crime and prison documentaries like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing carefully researched, factual stories like this one to life. The prison built for control. ADX Florence officially opened in 1994 and is operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The facility was constructed after decades of escalating violence inside U.S. federal prisons. During the 1970s and 1980s, several high-security federal institutions experienced serious security failures. Assaults on staff increased. Organized prison gangs expanded their influence. Some inmates continued running criminal operations from behind bars. One of the most significant turning points came after the 1983 murders of 2 correctional officers at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Following those killings, Marion was placed under permanent lockdown. That lockdown model would later influence the design of ADX Florence. Unlike traditional maximum security prisons, ADX Florence was specifically engineered to house inmates who could not be safely managed anywhere else in the federal system. The facility is sometimes described by corrections experts as a prison within a prison model, designed to remove nearly all opportunities for inmate coordination or violence. The prison sits on approximately 37 acres of land near the town of Florence, Colorado. Its remote location was intentionally chosen. Isolation from major urban centers reduces the risk of coordinated escape attempts and limits external communication networks. The complex is constructed almost entirely of reinforced concrete. Windows are narrow and angled to prevent inmates from seeing the surrounding landscape or identifying their exact location within the facility. Even natural light is carefully controlled. Inside, every design feature serves a security function. Door systems operate electronically from centralized control stations. Movement pathways are segmented. Surveillance is constant. And many housing units are designed to prevent inmates from ever physically encountering each other. But within ADX Florence, not all units are identical. And among them, the control unit stands as one of the most restrictive housing environments ever developed in the American correctional system. Who is sent to the control unit? Placement in the control unit is not automatic. Inmates arrive at ADX Florence through a multi-layered classification process conducted by federal prison officials. Most prisoners sent to ADX Florence have committed extremely serious crimes or have demonstrated an inability to function safely in other high-security prisons. However, not every inmate at ADX is placed inside the control unit itself. According to federal prison classification guidelines, inmates assigned to the most restrictive housing often fall into several categories: individuals convicted of terrorism-related offenses, leaders or influential members of violent prison gangs, inmates who have murdered or seriously assaulted correctional staff, prisoners who have repeatedly organized violence while incarcerated. Escape risks with documented attempts or planning. Federal records indicate that placement decisions rely heavily on documented behavior rather than solely on the original crime. An inmate who committed a violent offense years earlier but maintained stable conduct in custody may be housed in less restrictive environments. By contrast, inmates who demonstrate ongoing disruptive or violent behavior may be transferred to control unit housing regardless of their original conviction. The review process involves correctional staff, psychologists, and administrative officials. Inmates are typically notified of placement decisions, although advocacy groups have argued that some aspects of the process lack transparency. The exact criteria and internal deliberations surrounding placement are not fully disclosed to the public. What is documented, however, is that inmates assigned to control unit housing experience some of the strictest living conditions in the federal prison system. And those conditions begin with the cell itself. The cell, designed for isolation. Cells inside the control unit measure approximately 7 feet by 12 feet. Nearly every surface is constructed from poured or reinforced concrete. The furniture is not traditional furniture at all. Beds are formed directly into the wall as concrete slabs. Desks and stools are often molded into the structure. Toilets and sinks are made from stainless steel and are connected to controlled water systems that correctional staff can monitor and regulate. Each cell contains a narrow window approximately 4 inches wide. The windows are positioned and angled in a way that allows natural light to enter but prevents inmates from seeing other prisoners, the prison yard, or surrounding terrain. The design is deliberate. Architects and corrections planners built these cells to eliminate opportunities for communication between inmates. Sound transmission between cells is minimized. Visual contact is largely prevented. And physical interaction is virtually impossible. Doors are solid metal, typically containing only a small food slot and, in some cases, a narrow viewing panel for staff observation. Inmates in the control unit typically spend 23 hours per day inside these cells. The remaining hour is usually designated for recreation, which occurs in small, enclosed exercise areas. These recreation spaces are often described in court filings and correctional records as individual concrete enclosures or cage-like structures. Access to reading materials, legal documents, and limited personal property is allowed but strictly regulated. Television is permitted in some units, typically limited to educational or approved programming. Lighting schedules are controlled externally, and correctional officers conduct regular security checks throughout the day and night. The environment is designed to maximize order, predictability, and surveillance. But these physical conditions also create an environment of profound social isolation, a factor that has generated significant debate among corrections experts, psychologists, and human rights organizations. A day inside 23-hour confinement. Daily life inside the control unit follows a rigid schedule structured around security procedures. Meals are delivered directly to cells through food slots built into cell doors. Inmates typically eat alone. Meals are prepared according to federal nutritional guidelines and are distributed 3 times per day. Most daily activities occur inside the cell. Inmates may read, write, exercise individually, watch approved television programming, or review legal materials. Access to educational programs is limited but may include correspondence courses or monitored instructional broadcasts. Communication with family members usually occurs through monitored phone calls or written correspondence. Physical visitation, when allowed, is typically conducted through secure, non-contact visiting systems separated by reinforced glass barriers. Recreation time usually occurs once per day. During this period, inmates are escorted individually to secure recreation enclosures. Movement procedures involve multiple layers of security, including hand restraints and officer escorts. These procedures are designed to prevent any opportunity for coordinated violence or escape attempts. Inmates are also subject to regular wellness checks conducted by correctional staff and mental health professionals. Federal policy requires ongoing monitoring, although advocacy groups and independent researchers have debated whether such monitoring adequately addresses long-term psychological effects. Precise daily routines can vary slightly depending on the housing unit, security level adjustments, and individual behavioral assessments. But the core structure remains consistent. 23 hours alone. 1 hour outside the cell. Every day. For some inmates, this routine lasts months. For others, it lasts years. And for a small number, it may last decades. Why such extreme security exists? Supporters of supermax prisons argue that facilities like ADX Florence were created as a response to documented failures in earlier prison security models. Throughout the late 20th century, prison violence increased in several high-security institutions. Correctional officers were assaulted or killed. Organized prison gangs expanded operations across multiple states. In some cases, inmates continued directing criminal activity through smuggled communication systems. Supermax prisons were designed to address these challenges by eliminating opportunities for inmate coordination. Federal corrections officials have repeatedly stated that ADX Florence houses inmates who present exceptional management risks. According to official statements, the goal is not punishment beyond sentencing, but the maintenance of institutional safety and protection of staff and other prisoners. However, critics argue that long-term isolation may create additional risks rather than reducing them. Some psychological researchers have raised concerns that extended solitary confinement can contribute to anxiety, depression, cognitive difficulties, and other mental health complications. Federal courts have reviewed multiple lawsuits filed by inmates and advocacy organizations regarding ADX conditions. Some cases resulted in policy adjustments, including expanded mental health screening and treatment protocols. The full long-term impact of supermax confinement remains an area of ongoing academic and legal debate. What is documented is that ADX Florence remains one of the most secure prison environments in the world. And at its core lies a housing system built to separate individuals not just from society, but often from each other. ADX Florence was designed as the final destination for inmates considered too dangerous for any other federal prison. Inside its control unit, isolation becomes routine. Silence becomes structure. And time moves according to a system built entirely around containment. But isolation is only one part of the story. The psychological reality of 23 hours alone. The human mind in extreme isolation. While the physical structure of control unit housing is carefully documented, the psychological experience of prolonged isolation has been the subject of decades of research, legal review, and public debate. Extended solitary confinement, typically defined by researchers as confinement lasting 22 hours or more per day, has been studied by psychologists, correctional experts, and human rights investigators across multiple countries and prison systems. Research compiled by organizations such as the American Psychological Association has examined how human beings respond to extreme social isolation. Their findings suggest that long-term isolation can create significant mental health challenges for some individuals. Documented symptoms in various studies have included anxiety, depression, a difficulty concentrating, a sleep disruption, a heightened stress responses, a emotional withdrawal. Some researchers have also reported cases involving hallucinations or paranoia, although the frequency and severity of such symptoms vary widely between individuals. It is important to note that not all inmates experience these effects in the same way. Correctional psychologists and prison officials have repeatedly stated that inmates assigned to supermax housing often already have extensive histories of violence or instability, which can complicate efforts to isolate the psychological impact of confinement itself. The precise relationship between solitary confinement and long-term psychological damage remains actively debated within academic and correctional communities. What remains undisputed is that the environment inside control unit housing is one of the most socially restrictive living arrangements used in modern incarceration systems. Documented inmate experiences. Over the years, a limited number of inmate accounts have become public through court filings, legal testimony, and monitored correspondence released by attorneys or advocacy groups. Because of strict communication controls, detailed first-hand narratives from control unit inmates remain relatively rare. However, some statements have entered the public record during federal lawsuits and administrative reviews. In multiple filings reviewed by courts, inmates described the experience of losing track of time due to repetitive daily routines and limited environmental stimulation. Others reported heightened sensitivity to sound or light, while some described difficulty maintaining social communication skills after extended periods without direct human interaction. Advocacy organizations such as Human Rights Watch have compiled interviews with former supermax inmates across several facilities, including federal institutions. Their reports often describe emotional distress and feelings of extreme loneliness. Federal prison officials have disputed some of these claims, stating that inmates have access to mental health staff, reading materials, monitored phone calls, and recreational opportunities that are designed to reduce the impact of isolation. Due to the restricted nature of supermax facilities, independent long-term observational research inside ADX Florence remains limited. As a result, many conclusions rely on a combination of court testimony, post-release interviews, and medical records rather than continuous in-facility monitoring. The absence of comprehensive public data continues to make the full psychological impact of control unit housing difficult to measure with complete certainty. Mental health monitoring inside control unit housing. Federal prison policy requires mental health monitoring for inmates placed in highly restrictive housing environments. Staff psychologists conduct periodic evaluations designed to assess emotional stability, behavioral risk, and potential psychiatric concerns. The Federal Bureau of Prisons operates under internal program statements that require mental health staff to review inmate records, conduct interviews, and recommend treatment when necessary. Treatment options may include counseling sessions conducted through secure barriers, psychiatric medication management, behavioral monitoring programs, crisis intervention protocols. Federal records indicate that inmates identified with serious mental illness may be transferred to specialized treatment units or medical centers rather than remaining in control unit housing. However, lawsuits filed throughout the early 2000s challenged whether screening procedures were sufficient. Some inmates alleged that individuals with severe psychiatric disorders were kept in extreme isolation for extended periods without adequate treatment. One major settlement agreement in 2015 required expanded mental health screening and increased monitoring procedures for inmates housed at ADX Florence. Federal authorities agreed to improve diagnostic evaluations and provide additional treatment options for prisoners with documented mental illness. Details of individual treatment outcomes remain confidential under federal privacy law, making comprehensive evaluation of the policy changes difficult. What is documented is that mental health monitoring now plays a central role in determining whether inmates remain in control unit housing or are transferred to alternative units. How long do inmates stay? One of the most frequently asked questions surrounding control unit housing is how long inmates remain in such restrictive confinement. The answer varies significantly. Federal prison officials state that control unit placement is intended to be behavior-based rather than permanent. In theory, inmates who demonstrate sustained compliance with prison rules may progress through step-down programs designed to gradually reintroduce social interaction and increased privileges. The step-down system typically involves movement through housing levels with progressively expanded out-of-cell time, increased programming opportunities, and limited group interaction under supervision. However, public records indicate that progression timelines vary widely between inmates. Some prisoners have moved through step-down programs within several years, while others have remained in highly restrictive housing for significantly longer periods. Advocacy groups have argued that unclear progression criteria can make it difficult for inmates to understand how to advance through the system. Federal prison administrators maintain that security risks and behavioral evaluations require individualized assessment rather than standardized timelines. Precise statistical data on average control unit stay durations is not fully available to the public, and internal classification decisions remain largely confidential. What is documented is that the possibility of eventual transfer exists, but it is neither automatic nor guaranteed. For inmates in the control unit, time can feel suspended between disciplinary review and behavioral evaluation. And sometimes, the uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. Legal challenges and constitutional questions. Conditions inside ADX Florence have been challenged in multiple federal lawsuits over the past 3 decades. These cases often focus on whether long-term isolation violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Several lawsuits filed in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado examined claims that extreme isolation contributed to severe psychological harm. In the case Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, inmates argued that ADX Florence failed to properly treat prisoners with serious mental illness. The case resulted in a settlement agreement requiring enhanced screening procedures, improved treatment access, and additional staff training. Federal courts have generally ruled that supermax confinement is legally permissible when justified by legitimate security concerns and accompanied by appropriate monitoring procedures. However, courts have also emphasized that prisons must provide adequate medical and mental health care regardless of housing level. Legal scholars continue to debate where the constitutional boundary exists between necessary security measures and excessive psychological harm. International human rights organizations have also criticized prolonged solitary confinement, with some United Nations experts arguing that isolation lasting longer than 15 days may constitute cruel or degrading treatment. These interpretations, however, are not legally binding within U.S. federal law. The legal status of supermax confinement remains complex, shaped by ongoing litigation, policy revisions, and evolving scientific research. Staff perspectives and security realities. Correctional officers assigned to ADX Florence operate in one of the most tightly controlled prison environments in the country. Staff training emphasizes constant vigilance, structured communication protocols, and coordinated response procedures. Former federal correctional officials interviewed by national news organizations have described ADX Florence as a facility where security design significantly reduces direct confrontation between inmates and staff. Electronic doors, remote monitoring, and segmented movement pathways allow officers to maintain control while minimizing physical risk. Some correctional officers have publicly stated that the supermax model protects staff from the types of assaults and organized violence that plagued earlier high-security prisons. Others have acknowledged that working in an environment built around extreme isolation can present psychological stress for staff as well. Correctional work at supermax facilities often involves prolonged monitoring of high-risk inmates without traditional interpersonal interaction that exists in lower security institutions. Reliable statistical data comparing staff injury rates between ADX Florence and other federal prisons remains limited, though federal prison officials have consistently cited supermax design as a safety improvement. The experiences of correctional staff remain an often overlooked dimension of the supermax debate, balancing workplace safety with ethical concerns about extreme inmate isolation. Inside the control unit, isolation is not accidental. It is engineered, structured, and constantly monitored. For prison officials, it represents the highest level of institutional control. For critics, it raises difficult ethical and psychological questions that remain unresolved. But the control unit is only one part of ADX Florence. Why certain inmates require extreme containment? Not every inmate housed at ADX Florence is assigned there for the same reason. While some prisoners are transferred due to violent behavior inside other prisons, others arrive because of the national or international security risks they represent. The control unit and other highly restrictive housing sections are designed to contain inmates whose influence extends beyond prison walls. Federal officials have stated that one of ADX Florence's primary goals is preventing inmates from directing criminal or terrorist activity from inside prison. Historically, several inmates transferred to ADX Florence were believed to have maintained communication networks capable of influencing criminal organizations, extremist groups, or violent prison gangs. The facility's design aims to sever those networks almost completely. Inmates considered high risk are often placed under special administrative measures, commonly referred to as SAMs. These measures restrict communication even further than standard supermax confinement. SAMs may limit phone calls, mail correspondence, legal communications, and visitation rights, all subject to national security review. Federal officials argue that these restrictions are necessary when intelligence agencies determine that an inmate could communicate coded messages or coordinate violent acts if given broader contact with the outside world. Critics, however, argue that such restrictions can further intensify the psychological effects of isolation and may limit access to legal representation. The use of SAMs remains controversial and is typically applied only to a small number of inmates considered extraordinary security risks. The case of Ted Kaczynski. One of the most widely known inmates ever housed at ADX Florence was Ted Kaczynski, widely known as the Unabomber. Kaczynski was arrested in 1996 after a nationwide investigation linked him to a mail bombing campaign that spanned nearly 2 decades. Between 1978 and 1995, his attacks killed 3 people and injured 23 others across the United States. Federal prosecutors charged Kaczynski with multiple counts of terrorism and murder. He ultimately pleaded guilty in 1998 and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Following his conviction, Kaczynski was transferred to ADX Florence, where he remained for many years. Public records indicate he was not initially placed in the most restrictive control unit but was still housed under supermax conditions. Kaczynski's case presented unique challenges. Unlike many violent offenders, he had a documented academic background as a former mathematics professor. His ideological motivations and anti-technology writings were closely monitored by prison authorities concerned about potential influence over extremist movements. Court records show that Kaczynski occasionally communicated through written correspondence, though all communication remained subject to federal monitoring. In 2021, he was transferred to a federal medical facility after deteriorating health conditions were reported. He died in federal custody in 2023. Official reports listed natural causes related to medical complications, though full medical details remain partially restricted under federal privacy law. Kaczynski's long incarceration highlighted the federal government's approach to managing domestic terrorism offenders considered intellectually influential as well as physically dangerous. The case of Ramzi Yousef. Ramzi Yousef was one of the earliest terrorism-related inmates transferred to ADX Florence after its opening. Yousef was convicted for orchestrating the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. The attack killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000 others when a truck bomb exploded beneath the North Tower. Investigators later uncovered evidence that Yousef had planned additional attacks, including an alleged international airline bombing plot known as the Bojinka plot. The full scope of that plot remains partially disputed due to incomplete operational evidence and intercepted planning documents. Following his conviction in 1998, Yousef was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 240 years. Federal officials determined that Yousef posed both a physical and ideological threat due to his demonstrated ability to coordinate complex international terrorist operations. Yousef was placed under strict communication monitoring and, according to publicly available federal documents, remained subject to special administrative measures for extended periods. Court filings indicate that Yousef challenged certain confinement conditions through legal appeals, arguing that communication restrictions violated constitutional protections. Federal courts repeatedly upheld the restrictions, citing national security concerns. Yousef remains in federal custody as of publicly available prison records, though specific housing details are classified for security reasons. His case remains one of the earliest examples of how ADX Florence became central to the United States counterterrorism incarceration strategy. The case of Zacarias Moussaoui. Zacarias Moussaoui is the only individual convicted in U.S. courts for direct conspiracy involvement related to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Although he was not one of the hijackers who carried out the attacks, prosecutors argued that Moussaoui played a supporting operational role. He was arrested in August 2001 after raising suspicions during flight training in Minnesota. Following a highly publicized federal trial, Moussaoui pleaded guilty in 2005 to multiple terrorism-related charges. In 2006, a federal jury sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole, rejecting the death penalty. Moussaoui was later transferred to ADX Florence under special administrative measures. Federal authorities cited concerns that he could communicate extremist propaganda or inspire additional attacks if given broader communication privileges. Court documents reveal that Moussaoui frequently filed legal motions and grievances regarding his confinement and communication restrictions. Many of these filings were reviewed and denied by federal courts. Due to national security classification, detailed housing arrangements for Moussaoui remain largely undisclosed. However, public records confirm he has been continuously held within the ADX Florence system under strict communication controls. His case illustrates the prison's role in managing inmates connected to globally significant acts of terrorism. The case of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Joaquin Guzman, widely known as El Chapo, became one of the most internationally recognized inmates transferred to ADX Florence in modern history. Guzman was the longtime leader of the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. Mexican and U.S. authorities linked him to large-scale narcotics trafficking, organized crime operations, and multiple violent acts carried out by cartel affiliates. Guzman became infamous for escaping from Mexican prisons twice, once in 2001 through alleged bribery of prison staff and again in 2015 through a tunnel connected directly to his cell. After his recapture in 2016, Guzman was extradited to the United States. In 2019, he was convicted in federal court on multiple charges, including drug trafficking conspiracy, continuing criminal enterprise, and firearms offenses. Following sentencing to life imprisonment plus 30 years, Guzman was transferred to ADX Florence. According to court filings, Guzman's defense attorneys challenged the extreme communication restrictions imposed under special administrative measures. They argued that the restrictions limited his ability to maintain family contact and legal communication. Federal courts upheld the restrictions, citing Guzman's documented history of directing criminal operations from prison environments. Publicly available records confirm Guzman remains in federal custody at ADX Florence, though specific housing classification remains restricted. His case demonstrates how ADX Florence functions not only as a counterterrorism facility but also as a containment center for international organized crime leadership, balancing national security and human rights. The incarceration of high-profile inmates at ADX Florence continues to fuel ongoing debate about the balance between national security and human rights. Federal officials consistently maintain that supermax confinement protects both prison staff and the public from individuals capable of directing violence, even from within prison walls. Security experts often cite ADX Florence as one of the most escape-resistant facilities ever constructed. Since its opening in 1994, there have been no confirmed successful escapes. Human rights organizations, however, argue that prolonged isolation, especially under special administrative measures, raises serious ethical concerns. Some advocates have called for stricter time limits on solitary confinement or expanded oversight mechanisms. Legal scholars remain divided. Some argue that supermax facilities are necessary in rare cases involving extraordinary security threats. Others contend that long-term isolation risks violating international human rights standards, even when legally permissible under U.S. law. What remains clear is that ADX Florence operates at the intersection of law enforcement, national security, psychological science, and constitutional law. And few institutions generate as much debate about where the limits of incarceration should exist. The inmates housed at ADX Florence represent some of the most serious security threats identified by federal authorities. Their crimes, influence, and operational histories shaped the prison's evolution into one of the most restrictive incarceration systems in the world. But beyond the notoriety of individual prisoners lies another critical question. What happens when inmates leave ADX Florence? Is reintegration possible after years, sometimes decades, of extreme isolation? If you found this documentary insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps Beyond the Bars continue producing deeply researched, factual stories from the darkest corners of the justice system. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let us know which prison or case you want us to investigate next. Until then, stay informed, and we'll see you beyond the bars.